Before this video gets going, I just want to point out that a majority of this review I had made before Season 9 finished airing. Once Season 9 finished airing, I was still in the process of making this video, so I wrote a little addendum regarding Season 9, which is tagged on at the end. I make a couple of general remarks and speculation about Season 9 in the main review itself, but those things are all clarified at that little section at the end. I've heard insanity defined as doing something over and over again and expecting different results. Whether or not this is the true definition of insanity, if you're familiar with the television series The Walking Dead, and even more so if you're familiar with where it stands today in the court of public opinion, you probably know where I'm going with that opening statement. For those of you who don't know, because I'm sure that there's at least one person watching who doesn't know what The Walking Dead is, or maybe only has a vague idea, the premise of The Walking Dead is following a group of survivors through a zombie apocalypse. This is the bare bones premise of the show. As of writing this review, the show is currently wrapping up Season 9. Season 9. Which means that The Walking Dead has been in the public consciousness for at least a decade. In that decade, The Walking Dead went from being possibly one of the most anticipated, renowned, fan-favored shows of all time, with some even comparing it to Game of Thrones in terms of fan base and viewership, to an almost shell of its former self. The Walking Dead has essentially become a meme at the time of writing this review, with many people in posts online expressing their negative opinion of people who even still watch the show. I'm going to give the spoiler warning here so I can start discussing specific items. If you want to watch the show, you should. It's genuinely entertaining and even brilliant in some places, more specifically early on, the first couple of seasons or so. In my opinion, the show takes a huge dive in quality in seasons 3 and 4, but then comes back slightly in 5 and 6, only to take another huge dive by the time seasons 7 and 8 roll around and season 9 isn't looking too good either. There's a lot of frustration due to how the show is and was handled because audiences saw potential that was not being reached, or simply being wasted to fill airtime. Now that all the seasons up to this point are available to stream, it might be easier to watch since there is so much filler between main plot points, and you could just sort of binge through them. So yeah, there's my spoiler warning. I'm also guessing that this video will end up being somewhat long just due to the dense nature of the show and how many seasons and points there are. Probably a lot longer than my typical review and analysis videos. If this is the case, I'll try to break down the different aspects of the video with timestamps in the description, along with a quick summary of what I discuss in that point so you can skip right to the part that seems interesting to you. So the big question this video will seek to answer is, where did it all go wrong? How did The Walking Dead sink so far below audience expectation? I've seen many people in videos try to answer this before. I've even heard people say things like, "Oh, it was definitely with the governor. That was dragged out way too long and killed the show." I've heard people say, "Oh, it was when they started dividing the episodes between groups. That was when the show died." Still other people will say, "Oh, it's when they fake killed Glenn. That was when the show died." Or maybe it was when they actually killed Glenn. Or maybe it was when they fake killed Rick. Or when they actually killed off Carl. Or maybe when all the camps ended up being divided. Or was it when they made viewers wait an entire year to find out who it was that they killed off by Negan? Or maybe it was Negan's prolonged introduction into the series because they knew how eager audiences were to see that character. Maybe that's what killed the show. I hope that you can see what I'm getting at here. There isn't one thing that caused The Walking Dead to sink. It was a culmination of things. It's almost impossible to point to one particular scene, episode, or even season and definitively say, that's where it all went wrong. I picture it almost like a cruise ship that's going straight. They make an incorrect adjustment and all of a sudden they're slightly off from the path that they started on. Fast forward a few hours, and now instead of being slightly off the path, they are now miles off the path. And it happened gradually because of small errors and lack of corrections during that time span. This, I believe, is what happened with The Walking Dead. They were doing really well for a while, great even, but due to a series of uncorrected errors along the way, they have lost a majority of their audience and fan base. The show has also been accused of stalling the main story in favor of filler in order to stretch out plot lines across seasons, ensuring AMC, the cash cow, would continue, AMC being the host network that's backing The Walking Dead. In order to fully understand these issues, though, it's important to have a fuller picture. So I'm going to briefly run through each season and the various problems they had to see if we can't see where the show went wrong, and to avoid this trend in future shows. So first, as always, I'll state where I'm coming from as I start this. I'm pretty sure that I've seen every episode of The Walking Dead up until now. I used to be really into it, but as the show's issues started becoming more and more apparent, I'd start putting the episodes on as more background noise as I did other things, only looking up occasionally when it sounded like an interesting scene was happening. There's only one episode of The Walking Dead that I'm sure I didn't see, and it was a purposeful decision because I assumed it would be a terrible episode. I'll talk about that later. I've also never read the comics. For some people, this might invalidate my opinion completely in their minds, but let me put it this way. I started getting into The Walking Dead because of the show. The show treats itself like a standalone piece of work, separate from the comics, even though it takes storylines, characters, and inspiration from the comics. I don't know exact percentages, but I'd say a majority of people who watch The Walking Dead may not even know it's based on a comic, and will judge it from the same vantage point as me, as just a television show. The last point I'll make here is that I don't hate The Walking Dead. I know that might be a shocker considering what this video is about, but yeah, I don't hate it. I mean, it's a show. Not only that, but I feel like The Walking Dead's risk to be edgy and different with its storytelling and graphic nature, especially in the beginning, has shifted the tone of many TV shows who didn't know such a thing was possible. It's undeniable the cultural impact The Walking Dead has had on society and media, even though its effects aren't always apparent or quantifiable. So with all that out of the way, I'll start the season summaries. I'm not going to go into major detail, and I will definitely skip over major events in favor of ones that highlight points I'm trying to make. I'm not going to talk about every single character, every single death, or every single story arc, but just the overall story of each season to the best of my ability. I'm also probably going to go off season summaries I find online, including the knowledge I have based off memory, because this show has been on for 10 years and I'm not going to rewatch all of it for the sake of this video. There is so much that happens in this show, so many characters and so many different story arcs. I apologize if I get a name wrong, put an event out of order, or misrepresent a detail. I'll try to be as accurate as possible. So let's start with Season 1. This will probably be the quickest season summary, mainly because it was the shortest and also because there wasn't too much wrong with it. It was well paced, well acted, and overall interesting. Zombies were still somewhat fresh, and people were excited to see a show emerge that didn't seem afraid to get gory and visceral with its storytelling. Season 1 begins by introducing the main character, Rick Grimes, and his sheriff deputy partner, Shane. It is also implied through their interaction that they're close friends as well. Rick is shot while on the job, and Shane rushes him to the hospital. He slips into a coma and awakens when the zombie apocalypse is in full swing. He's alone at the hospital and begins to search for his family. He's eventually helped out by Morgan, who's suspicious of him at first. Morgan has a son, and they explain to him what's going on. He forms a bond with the two, but eventually he leaves to continue his search for his family. He then makes it to the city where he is swarmed by zombies and saved by Glenn, who happens to be in the same group his family is in. His family being his wife Lori and his son Carl. The group wander around trying to find a safe spot for a while, but they eventually end up at the CDC. During this time, it's also shown that Shane has somewhat of a dark side. There is a huge difference in approach to what Shane does and what Rick does in certain situations. Rick is shaping up to be the leader of the group, and Shane usually deals with situations much more aggressively than Rick. This starts some tension between them. They make it to the CDC and they realize that there is only one survivor there, Dr. Jenner. Dr. Jenner admits to not knowing anything about the disease, and he tries to get the group to stay with him while he allows the building to self-destruct, essentially committing suicide. Some actually do stay, but many of the group end up leaving as the CDC explodes, killing everyone left inside. Some scenes of note here. Shane professes his love for Lori. While Rick was in a coma, Shane and Lori became a couple, and Shane is still holding on to those feelings even though Lori isn't, or says she isn't. Another scene of note is Dr. Jenner whispering something to Rick before they leave. I'm not sure when it's exactly revealed, maybe it's in season 2, but eventually you learn that Jenner whispered to Rick that everyone is infected. It doesn't matter if you get bit. Once you die, you turn into a zombie. And that's pretty much it for season 1. The pacing problems that exist in the following seasons don't really exist here, and it was a great season of television. Season 2 is also a good season, but it almost lost me because of how slow it is. I'll run through it quickly and then give my opinion on it. So, Season 2. The beginning of Season 2 revolves around problems with 2 of the kids in the group. One is Sophia and one is Carl. Sophia goes missing and the group goes looking for her. Shortly after this, Carl gets shot and Rick carries him to a nearby farm to get him medical attention. The rest of the season is pretty much spent on the farm focusing on somewhat boring storylines. In the first half of the season, Carl is recovering from being shot. Herschel, the owner of the farm, and his 2 daughters have a naive view of zombies, viewing them almost as people with rights and feeling they shouldn't be killed, while the group searches for Sophia, who is still missing. During all of this, Shane is getting more and more unhinged and having more and more problems with people in the group. All of this culminates in what might be one of my favorite Walking Dead scenes of all time in the mid-season finale. Shane goes crazy when he discovers that Herschel and his family are keeping walkers alive in the barn in hopes that they can eventually be cured. He releases the walkers and begins killing them. During all of this, it is revealed that Sophia, Carol's daughter, the girl that went missing in the beginning of the season, is one of the walkers in the barn. No one is able to muster what it takes to kill her except for Rick, who shoots her in the head with his signature Colt Python revolver. I like this scene because it was a culmination of everything that came before it, all of the tensions and emotions created finally coming to a head in the most disheartening way possible, something The Walking Dead became very good at doing, almost to a fault in later seasons. I think this is also the moment that Rick for sure establishes himself as the leader of the group, even though he was acting like the leader before this. The rest of the season mainly focuses on Herschel trying to hold on to his way of life on the farm, but more importantly the rising tension between Rick and Shane. This culminates in another great moment where Rick has to kill Shane when Shane brings Rick into a field to kill him. This is the first major decision Rick has to make in the series, and it's a big one. It's an excellent scene that continues to show character growth for Rick. I also enjoyed the finale of the series, which is the farm getting swamped by walkers, forcing the group to fight back, but eventually abandon the farm and get on the road again to find a safe place to stay. This is also the episode where the famous "This is not a democracy anymore" speech takes place.
You're staying. This isn't a democracy anymore.
I love this little bit of dialogue. It was great to see Rick finally lose it a little bit and show a glimpse of the hardened leader he would eventually become. So that was Season 2. Like I said earlier, Season 2 almost lost me completely because of how slow it was, especially in the first part of the season. It was essentially like a soap opera with zombies thrown in, so you'd remember what show you were watching. I also want to point out that besides Sophia and Shane, there were other major character deaths that I failed to mention. The reason I now look back on Season 2 favorably is mainly because I felt the payoff was worth the slowness in this case. The scene where Sophia exits the barn and is a zombie is great, in my opinion, and the confrontation between Rick and Shane is one of the best moments of the series. So while I feel like Season 2 was fairly boring with a great payoff, the poor pacing of Season 2 continued throughout the series, only without the part about the satisfying payoff. Storylines begin to be stretched so far and conflicts between the main groups and the big bads of the series become so dragged out, it almost seems like a joke. This is almost perfectly illustrated by Season 3, where this problem rears its ugly head in a big way. Season 3. Season 3 introduces a few major characters, mainly Michonne and the Governor. The Governor ends up being the big bad for the season, and Michonne eventually joins the group and becomes a main character, right up there with Rick and Daryl. Season 3 begins with the main group finding a prison to call home for a while. They clear the prison and have a confrontation with some prisoners, one of whom Rick kills off in a pretty vicious way.
Shit happens.
The viewer can see a shift in Rick, to someone who's a little bit more suspicious of people and much quicker to action. Since the attack at the farm from the previous season, some of the group has split up. Andrea, a main character who I didn't feel the need to mention until now, meets Michonne and they end up taking care of each other. They wind up at Woodbury, which is run by the Governor. During all of this, Lori is getting more and more pregnant and eventually has the baby with the aid of Maggie, one of Herschel's daughters. Lori dies giving birth and Carl shoots her in the head to prevent her from turning. Rick absolutely loses it when he finds out his wife is dead. This scene is incredibly acted by Andrew Lincoln. Glenn and Maggie are eventually captured by the Governor at the same time as Michonne leaves Woodbury to find Rick and company. Rick and his crew attempt to break into Woodbury and rescue Glenn and Maggie. This begins the conflict between the prison and Woodbury, or more accurately, Rick and the Governor, that stretches throughout this season and even into the next one. I'm not even going to go through every single detail of how the writers of the show were able to stretch out this conflict over the course of so many episodes. Each episode is essentially the same. Rick is threatening the Governor is threatening Rick. They intimate wanting peace between the communities, but it's never achieved. The show tries really hard to get you to understand that there are some people at Woodbury who are genuinely good and only follow the Governor because it's kept them safe. This goes on for the rest of the season. What makes this problem worse, in my opinion, is that they start to use the every other episode storyline style, for lack of a better term. Essentially what they do is this. You get one episode that revolves around Rick and the prison. You know, all the characters that you want to see and actually care about. Then you get one episode where you don't see any of those characters at all. Every other episode focuses on Woodbury or the Governor. These episodes are literally made to display how secretly evil the Governor is, how many citizens of Woodbury are blind to it, and how the Governor plans to destroy Rick. This format is absolutely brutal. I can see why they thought that this might be interesting, and in some way I applaud them for trying something new, but what they essentially did was make every other episode of their show something fans didn't really want to watch. It is truly shocking to me why the writers, directors, and showrunner would think that a show, which for the past 2 seasons is focused on the same group of characters, would want full episodes where you didn't see any of those characters at all. This problem is magnified to an amazing degree in Season 4. So at the end of Season 3, Woodbury and the prison finally have their standoff. It was okay, but for the amount of build-up that led up to it, it was almost guaranteed to fall short. Rick and his group at the prison are just able to hold them off and drive them back, So even the actual confrontation that the whole season has been building to results in a stalemate, essentially. I don't make the following statement lightly, but other than some character deaths like Lori and Angela, nothing happens in Season 3. I feel like the entirety of Season 3 could have been reduced to 3 episodes. The governor was not nearly interesting enough, threatening enough, or relatable enough to justify spending so much time on him. And since he doesn't die, you can bet he shows up again in Season 4, so let's get to that now. Season 4 begins and Rick is a gardener. He no longer wants to fight, and he doesn't even carry a gun around anymore. Things seem relatively peaceful, and to contrive some conflict, there's an outbreak of some disease in the prison, and they launch an investigation to figure out who did it. On the character side, Carol slowly is shown to be growing colder and more vicious. All of this is really filler, though, to get to the main point of this season: the return of the governor. I shit you not, they bring this guy back again. And not only do they do that, they do the same split episode tactic. So one episode focuses on Rick and his crew, and every other episode focuses on the governor. There is one episode that is literally primarily just him wandering around. I'm not even joking. He ends up finding a family who he stays with. He claims his name is Brian, and the show tries to fool you into thinking that he's changed and slowly becoming a good person. A few short episodes later, though, you learn that this isn't the case when he forms another gang to try to extract revenge on Rick and the rest of the prison. He captures Herschel and Michonne. Rick attempts one last time to broker a peace deal between the two. The governor denies it, kills Herschel, and a fight erupts. Rick and the governor beat each other almost to death, but the governor is killed half by Michonne and half by another character who is really forgettable. I think she's one of the members of the family that he stayed with. A lot of the characters become forgettable by this point in the show, actually. So at this point, the conflict with the governor has been stretched for a season and a half, and the governor isn't even that interesting of a villain. The whole stretch of episodes where they focused on him also ended up culminating in almost nothing as well, since after all of that, he simply reverted back to his evil Season 3 self, only to be ultimately killed, which should have happened in Season 3. He probably would have been killed in the previous season if this show wasn't so dead set on milking every storyline for as many episodes as possible to get as many seasons as they can out of this cash cow of a show. I know that previous statement was speculative, but I'm inclined to think that it was accurate. The rest of this season is, in all fairness, pretty good. Farmer Rick is no more, and the group is split up once again after the fight with the governor. We slowly see Rick embrace his animalistic qualities, realizing he has to do everything he can to survive and protect the people that he cares about. He even bites through the neck of an attacker in one scene to protect Carl, one of the most graphic scenes in the series up to this point. There are other storylines too of other members of the group since they got split up. This is once again told in the separate story method or the every other episode method. Carol is forced to execute a little girl because she's a psycho. Beth gets taken by an unknown group while scavenging with Daryl. Glenn and new character Tara meet up with new characters Abraham and Eugene. The season wraps up with a majority of the group being reunited at a place called Terminus, which was supposed to be a safe haven, but ends up being a trap created by a group of cannibals. The crew is herded into a storage container where Rick, who has become a straight savage at this point, says a badass line.
They're fucking with the wrong people.
This leads us right into Season 5. Season 5 begins with the group escaping Terminus and the cannibals. It's a decent scene, and it serves to show how battle-hardened the group is becoming. They're far less trusting after this, more ready to attack and kill than at any other point in the series. This is especially true of Rick, who is a considerably different person than he was in Season 1. Things are more complicated now. Not everything can be defined as good or bad, as right or wrong. After the group escapes Terminus, they meet Gabriel, who is a priest. He eventually becomes a pretty main character, but I struggle to see what his role or value is, especially when he's first introduced, other than the fact that the group uses his church. Later on, he gets a little bit better as a character, but I still don't know why he's there. Eventually, the group from Terminus ends up at the church in search of Rick and his crew. It was an ambush, though, and Rick and company brutally execute all of the members of Terminus at the church.
I already made you a promise.
This is meant to signify a major turning point for the group. The Terminus people were surrendering, but Rick and his group killed them anyway, and in a very brutal fashion, much to Gabriel's dismay. As I'm recording this, maybe Gabriel was meant to be a character that was supposed to be the group's conscience, but considering how flawed he was, I don't think that worked very well. This also marks the beginning of another terrible plotline that the show spends way too much time on for no payoff. Beth at the hospital. It's revealed that Beth is being held at a hospital as a kind of captive to a group that is run by a gang of corrupt cops. The main cop, Dawn Lerner, being the miniature big bad of this section, if that makes any sense. The show spends an inordinate amount of time fleshing out the hospital, the patients, Dawn, the other officers, and Beth, and all the while Rick and the main group get closer and closer to finding her. This lasts for a few episodes, and it finally culminates in Rick trying to negotiate the release of Beth and her newfound friend Noah. Things go wrong, though, and Beth ends up stabbing Dawn and getting shot in the head. So the net sum of that whole storyline was essentially zero, and it very much appeared like the whole thing was contrived to show A, what a cold-hearted killer Rick has become, and B, to kill off another main character to try to keep the audience interested in the show. The rest of the season focuses on the group's arrival in and adjustment to Alexandria, which honestly was my favorite part of the series since Season 2. Rick and his group eventually arrive at Alexandria, a community that for the most part seems untouched by the horrors of the outside world. The residents are happy, and to a large extent naive and unprepared for the harsh realities of the world around them. Then in comes Rick and crew, grizzled and battle-hardened to a T.
Because it's all about survival now. At any cost.
A large part of the rest of the season is Rick trying to convince Deanna, the leader of Alexandria, how their way of life isn't sustainable, and in order to survive they must be willing to do things they aren't comfortable with. Deanna believes that Rick's view of the world is primitive and unnecessary, and leads to more conflicts than it resolves.
Sounds like I'd want to be part of your family.
By the end of the season, though, after suffering the loss of her husband and son and seeing the horrors of what lurks outside Alexandria's walls, Deanna finally agrees with Rick's point of view. Oh, and somewhere in between here, Morgan shows up again too. Remember Morgan from Season 1? I really liked the second half of Season 5. It was different. There wasn't a real established big bad like other seasons, and it showed the group put in a position that they haven't been subjected to yet. Somewhat civilized society. The dynamic between Rick's perspective, coming from someone who has lived through terrible things and has seen almost everything, coming up against Deanna's perspective as someone who is idealistic and hasn't experienced loss in the way Rick has, was truly interesting and different to watch for the show. One of my favorite scenes probably in the whole series is in this season 2, where Rick is covered in blood after fighting with Pete, and he basically has a mental breakdown trying to get everyone to understand how incredibly sheltered they are, and about how wrong they are in regards to how they're living their lives. It all culminates in one crazy moment that in my opinion is one of the best in the entire series.
Me? You mean me? Your way's gonna destroy this place. It's gonna get people killed. It's already gotten people killed.
Rick finally snaps, and Michonne is forced to knock him out to prevent the situation from escalating. So other than the very beginning when they escape from Terminus, and the end where they arrive in Alexandria, I felt that the entire hospital storyline was a complete waste of time in the season. And since I already kind of talked about that when going through the plot, let's move on to Season 6. Season 6 is where some of the problems that appeared in Seasons 3 and 4 start to reappear a bit, in a huge way at the end of the season with the introduction of Negan. The finale to Season 6 was probably the most controversial and divisive episode of the series, and it was around this time that The Walking Dead lost the trust of a lot of its viewership because of the way that they handled the finale. But before we get to that, let's recap the first part of Season 6. The first part of Season 6 focuses on a mega herd of zombies headed for Alexandria and the group's efforts to stop and reroute them.
This is how.
There's a forgettable group here called the Wolves, who serve as sort of a mini big bad once again, so the group has some human enemies to fight against. They also do a fake out of Glenn dying here too. He gets knocked off a dumpster into a group of zombies and his fate is left unknown. Meanwhile, Rick and the group try to teach the Alexandrians how to defend themselves. During this time too, there's another bigger group that's being teased, the group that will later be revealed as the Saviors, run by the one and only Negan. Anyway, this part of the season culminates in Alexandria getting attacked by a massive group of walkers, and the town, for a lack of a better word to describe it, comes together to fight them. When Season 6 returns in the second half, it picks up right where it left off. Things go wrong though, and Carl ends up getting his eye shot out, causing him to wear an eye patch for the rest of the series. The remainder of the season is basically one big build-up to the introduction of Negan, and arguably one of the most frustrating finales of any season of television. A few main plot points are scattered across the second half of Season 6. Some characters pair up and become couples like Rick and Michonne, and Sasha and Abraham. Maggie is pregnant, and the group begins killing patrols and substations of the group known as the Saviors, run by the mysterious Negan. At one point, the group even thinks they've killed Negan, but they're mistaken. At the end of Season 6, Negan is finally introduced as he has the group of main characters on their knees as he decides which one of them he'll execute as a punishment for killing so many of his soldiers.
Let's meet the man. Pissing our pants yet?
Negan plays a game of eeny meeny miny mo to pick the person, and as the individual is selected and Negan's barbed wire wrapped bat comes down on their head, the camera switches to a first person perspective and the episode fades to black.
They're all gonna be doing that.
The viewer doesn't get to see who was killed. This angered a lot of people, especially hardcore fans of the show and the comics who knew that this scene was coming and was curious to see how they'd handle it. What was even worse was it felt like the entire B half of Season 6 was building to this moment, and rather than delivering, they pulled back and forced audiences to wait a year before finding out who would be eliminated from the show. Although the showrunner tried to defend the decision, saying that it was a creative one and that the payoff would be worth it, and that audiences would understand why they did what they did once they saw the first episode of Season 7, it didn't quell the initial outburst of hatred for the finale. Now, on one hand, I can see how this was an effective cliffhanger. In some aspects, it guaranteed viewers to return to at least watch the Season 7 premiere if they wanted to know who was executed. And it might have gone over well if the series hadn't had such a reputation for stretching out storylines and packing their seasons full of filler. Many people even accused AMC and even the showrunner of The Walking Dead for choosing to go the cliffhanger route for monetary reasons, claiming that execs at AMC thought that Season 7 would prove to be more financially viable if there was a looming unanswered question of who got killed going into it. This could possibly be true since at the end of the day it is all about money, especially when you're dealing with a large parent company like AMC, but it's also very possible that this was simply a creative decision gone wrong. At this point in the series, people start realizing what the Walking Dead formula was becoming, maybe even long before this point. A major event happens in the season premiere. The rest of the episodes leading up to the mid-season finale are either the fallout of that event or preparing for an event to come. Most of this doesn't progress the plot and is mostly filler. The mid-season finale comes and something crazy happens again to justify all the slow pacing and filler leading up to it. Then the second half of the season begins, and maybe something interesting happens in the episode back. The rest of the season then slows to a crawl as it builds to the finale, which is usually the introduction of some new big bad or problem to be resolved in the following season, rinse and repeat. The development and implementation of this formula, purposeful or not, is one of the main reasons why The Walking Dead lost so much good grace with audiences over the years. It simply began to feel like each season, comprised of 12 or 13 episodes, only had about 3 episodes worth watching that actually moved the plot forward. The Walking Dead has another problem that I'll get more into after the brief summary of Season 7. It has an almost comical obsession with drawn-out character development. Now, character development sounds like a great thing, right? Especially in a show, and in most cases it is. But not when it's done the way The Walking Dead usually does it. I have an explanation for that statement, but first, Season 7. Season 7 begins with Negan killing Abraham and then Glenn. The episode is well done, and the fact that Negan kills 2 people instead of 1 came as somewhat of a surprise. Did it justify the infuriating Season 6 cliffhanger? I don't really know. It's really up to the individual viewer, I guess. I'm going to really oversimplify the plot of this whole season so I can get to what I wanted to talk about for this section. The rest of the season revolves around Negan trying to keep Rick and his group as well as the rest of Alexandria in line, while Rick and company desperately attempt to appease Negan while simultaneously figuring out a way to overthrow and kill him. Multiple communities are introduced in this season, and by the end there are dozens of new characters to keep track of. Just off the top of my head, Alexandria led by Rick, Hilltop led by Gregory, who's a prick, the Kingdom complete with its own king and tiger, the Garbage People, Oceanside, a colony of warrior women, and the Saviors led by Negan. There are some character deaths in the season besides the ones in the premiere, and some of the dynamics begin to shift a little between characters, but honestly there's so much going on and so many characters to keep track of it isn't worth to mention them in this video. So by the end of the season, it appears as though the communities are through with Negan's oppression and are willing to join together to fight him. Now I'll take a moment to talk about how The Walking Dead takes character development to an insane and unnecessary level, one that's actually to the detriment of the show. I'll start off by saying this. Character development is good. It's a good thing when a movie or show takes the time to flesh out main characters in an organic way so the audience has more of a reason to care about those characters. This is even true for minor characters. By fleshing out minor characters, it can cause an audience to appreciate them a little bit more. The problem that The Walking Dead has that seemed almost unavoidable as the show grew is how many characters it has. At any one time, The Walking Dead could have upwards of 15 to 20 main or semi-main characters to keep track of. Of these, audience members generally only care about maybe 4 or 5 of them. However, The Walking Dead has this nasty habit of taking some of the least popular of those 15 to 20 characters and spending an inordinate amount of time telling their backstory, giving them minutes upon minutes of dialogue, even dedicating whole episodes to them. This alone can be frustrating to a viewer who simply doesn't care about that character. The show tries to force viewers to care about certain characters through contrived drama and situations that don't make any sense. I'll use Dawn, the police officer from season 4 or 5, as an example. There was a massive amount of time spent developing not only her character, but the relationship between her and Beth. They were enemies, but they respected each other. There were whole episodes dedicated to this. But then, a few episodes later, they both ended up dead, and they hadn't really even had too much interaction with the main group previous to this. Was it necessary then to spend so much time devoted to this storyline? I understand that the writers were trying to make you feel something for these characters so that their deaths would feel more meaningful, but devoting so much time to a minor character only to kill them off simply isn't the right way to do it. A viewer should come to appreciate a character naturally over time, especially in a television series, through seeing how that character interacts with others and responds to certain situations. It is a fallacy to think that you can take a character who's pretty much a background character, write them an episode or two to try to force the viewer to care about them, and then kill off the character immediately to try to trigger an emotional impact. It just doesn't work. It also becomes a crutch for the writers and the showrunner because by using this method they can avoid killing off any real main characters, the ones with real emotional impact. Of all the deaths on the show, I would say that only a handful had real emotional impact. Glenn, and I suppose by proximity Abraham, Herschel, Shane, and maybe one or two others that I can't think of right now. A majority of the deaths simply have no impact because the show didn't do a good job of making the character likable or relatable despite spending so much time trying to do so. There were and are many times on The Walking Dead where all of a sudden a character out of nowhere starts getting a lot of lines or scenes. And then whole plot lines start revolving around this person, and I'm left thinking, wait, what? Who is this person again? Have they even been on the show before? Now in some cases this can work. They can take a background character or a minor character and turn them into a major one that the audience really likes. The problem is they try this so often that so many characters become forgettable and no one really cares who they are. Another character example I'll give is Gabriel. I absolutely hated him when he was first introduced because he annoyingly disagreed with everything just to create conflict within the group, from a writing standpoint that is. Later on he ended up getting better, but I still struggled to see what his purpose was that couldn't also have been done by another character that I was more familiar with. I'll throw Sasha in there as well in the list of storylines that I really just couldn't care less about. The character of Jesus sort of fell in there too. He was important for maybe a quarter of a season, but then faded into obscurity only to be brought back to importance for a few episodes before being killed off, as if that would make us care more. The show does this over and over again, and if you've been watching from the beginning, chances are you've recognized this pattern. So with that out of the way, let's go to Season 8. We're almost done here. Season 8 was advertised as all-out war between Alexandria, Hilltop, Kingdom, and eventually Oceanside, and the Saviors and Negan. I'm not exaggerating when I say that this struggle lasted the entire season and was a little more amped up, slightly more action-packed version of the Woodbury/Governor v. Prison/Rick scenario we talked about in Season 3. The two sides fight, there's a slight advantage, someone betrays someone else, the group tries to get help or support or weapons to continue fighting, they strategize, they plan, it looks like they won, but Negan pulls a fast one and outsmarts them all at the last minute. The whole season is like this. The major plot point of the season, besides the defeat of Negan, is probably the death of Carl, mainly because it was pretty unexpected. Carl gets bit and eventually dies, but not before writing letters to people he cared about, including Negan, expressing his wishes that they resolve their issues with no more violence or loss of life. The show mourns him appropriately by giving him a whole episode, which is justified since he's one of the only characters left that has been on the show since Season 1. Controversy about killing off Carl aside, Carl's death is the primary reason why, when Rick finally fights Negan and wins, he doesn't finish him off, but instead saves him and puts him in prison.
Save him.
Season 8 felt long. And despite it trying to capitalize on the war aspect by having a lot of action sequences, it ultimately felt pretty boring, and it still followed that same formulaic approach to the season that we discussed earlier in the video. This brings us to the current season at the time of writing this review, Season 9, Rick's supposed final season, which AMC advertised to no end leading up to it. I won't do a summary of Season 9 since it hasn't completed yet at the time of making this, but enough of it is aired for me to make the following statement. AMC and The Walking Dead don't seem to care about you as a viewer. They don't seem to care about artistic integrity or telling a compelling story or giving the longtime fans and viewers of the series a good experience. They care, ironically, about keeping The Walking Dead as alive as possible so they can milk as many seasons, spin-offs, and TV movies out of it as they can. Rick didn't die in his, quote, last episode as many promos from AMC and The Walking Dead tried to make people believe. He was simply whisked away via secret helicopter in preparation for a spin-off miniseries that revolves around Rick.
I found him.
So most likely by 2020, here's where The Walking Dead will be as a product. It will be gearing up for its 10th season. The spin-off show Fear the Walking Dead will probably also be gearing up for its next season. I'm not sure, I don't follow the show at all, but I don't see why they'd cancel it if it's getting views, which I'm pretty sure it is. And the spin-off series starring Rick Grimes will either have yet to air or have aired already. I'm left not really knowing how to feel about this. Although there are some characters that I genuinely liked on the show, its ability to keep people interested and engaged has definitely dropped off significantly. They resort to cheap tactics to keep people watching, from dangling the appearance of fan favorite Negan in front of fans all season long, to leaving viewers wondering which one of their favorite characters would be executed, to touting that Season 9 would be Rick Grimes' final season. It almost seems like there isn't any trick that they won't use to get people to watch, except for maybe having a decent story, well-paced plot lines, and eliminating the filler. Like I said, I can't speak for Season 9 since it hasn't finished yet, but nothing about this season has me very excited either. Even the entrance of the mysterious Whisperers. If you look at a graph of the viewership of the show throughout the 9 seasons, you'll notice a downward trend that starts at about Season 4 or 5, right around the time they mastered the art of dragging out storylines that no one cares about, and continues downward until it reaches a low at the beginning of Season 8. The viewership then slightly rises leading into Season 9, and I can only attribute that to the fact that they harped so much on the fact that it was Rick's final season. The only episode of The Walking Dead that I haven't seen was the episode right after Rick's supposed last one. Since the network revealed their plans for Rick's character, I just didn't want to go through the dramatic irony of having a bunch of characters express grief over Rick's death when he was gearing up for a miniseries. If you reach this point in the video, then I applaud you, and I hope you're able to get an idea of where I'm coming from with some of these points and criticisms. The Walking Dead is not a terrible show, far from it even, with evidence of brilliance in acting and directing and storytelling throughout, mainly in its earlier seasons, but also in Season 5. I know me saying this seems almost contrary to everything that I just said, but this critique is not meant to tear the show down, it's meant to point out what it could do better. I can't exactly say that it was solely corporate greed that led to it becoming such a mediocre show. That had a part, I'm sure, as many of these money-hungry corporations that try to stick their hands in a creative endeavor usually ruin it with what they think should happen, or try to force decisions upon creatives that they feel will result in the most financial gain, not necessarily what's best for the story or work itself. It's not totally the writers' or showrunners' fault either. They tried some things that I genuinely believe they thought was different and great, but a lot of times it ended up feeling contrived or boring. There's also the added pressure about needing to fill a certain amount of episodes for a season, and then worrying about having enough story to make it to the next season. Being so open-ended, it never feels like The Walking Dead is building toward anything. It just keeps going and going, like a soap opera. Some characters get endings or resolutions, sure, but the show goes on for so long and reuses so many of the same tropes, scenarios, and reskin storylines and villains that it becomes easy for viewers to pick out, which makes the show feel boring. Another problem is the amount of characters, like I said earlier. There are too many characters and they're spread so thin that it's impossible to care about more than 3 or 4 of them at once, max. I don't even know half of their names or where they came from, so why am I supposed to care if one of them dies or gets captured or something? It lowers the stakes and once again makes the show infinitely more uninteresting. I wish I had a better ending for this video, I really do, but to close, I guess I'll just say this. I opened this whole thing by saying that I've heard insanity defined as doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. After going through all this, it's hard to determine if that applies more to the creators of the show or the viewers. And that is where I was going to end this video initially. However, due to the amount of time that it took to record and edit this, Season 9 has wrapped up since first writing up the outline for this video. I made a few vague comments about Season 9 during the course of the video, and now that it is concluded and I've seen it, for the sake of fairness, I will go through Season 9, how it fits into the theme of this video, and what, in my opinion, it's trying to do to break away from the mold slightly in terms of story and characters. The first part of Season 9 focuses mainly on trying to integrate refugees from the Saviors into one of the three main communities, Alexandria, Hilltop, and the Kingdom. Trust is obviously an issue, and this leads to many conflicts throughout the episodes. You also discover that Negan has been locked up all this time. All of this is completely foreshadowed, though, by the fact that this is supposedly Rick Grimes' last few episodes of the series. Like I'm sure I mentioned earlier, the network pushed this point so hard in advertising that the beginning of Season 9 once again just felt like a waiting game for something to happen that would result in Rick's death. Rick doesn't die though, like I mentioned earlier, so I won't go into any of that or my opinions on that choice again here. Instead, I'll talk about where the show goes from the moment Rick is removed. There's some minor conflicts as the communities attempt to work together, yet develop individually as the following episodes take place after a time jump. There's some minor storylines regarding who will be the leaders of the various communities, how much they should be obligated to support each other as far as materials and food, and all in all attempting to create a more civilized world. The main storyline, though, revolves somewhat around the new big bad of the series, the Whisperers, a group of survivors who dress like zombies, even wearing their faces and clothing and blending in with herds, and the leader Alpha and her daughter. Strangely enough, the story almost takes a Romeo and Juliet type turn for a little while. If you aren't watching the show currently, then that might sound odd to you, so let me explain. The Whisperers ambush Jesus and Aaron in a graveyard. Jesus and Aaron obviously think that they're simply zombies that can be dispatched easily. However, one of the zombies pulls out a knife and stabs Jesus, killing him. This was probably one of the most unsettling moments this series has managed to create in a long time. It was pretty unexpected, and at this point the audience doesn't know why the zombies can now do such things, like wield weapons, run, and track to a much more intelligent degree. At first, maybe you think that the zombies are evolving into a higher class of predator. This is even suggested by one of the episode titles, Evolution. But later on, you find out that the zombies are not evolving, these are just people dressed like zombies. Eventually, the Alexandria group captures one of the Whisperers, Alpha's daughter, Lydia. There's a whole episode where she's in one of the prison cells next to Henry, who is in a cell for breaking some rules or something. The two begin to form a bond. Personally, I'm not a fan of Henry as a character and would have much rather seen Carl in this storyline instead, since he's a character they developed since the beginning and someone the audience was familiar with, but no, they killed him off in the previous season for almost no reason. Anyway, the rest of this part of the season is essentially the struggle for Lydia. She reveals that her mother, Alpha, is essentially an abusive monster. So when her mother comes to get her in exchange for 2 Alexandrians that she captured, Henry goes after her. Then he gets captured, but both of them are saved by Daryl and Connie, Connie being another new character who is deaf. The Whisperers then try to track down Daryl, Connie, Henry, and Lydia to kill them and take back Lydia, which results in a big fight in a large office-type building, and an even more intense fight between Daryl and Beta, the Whisperer's best fighter and Alpha's right-hand man. So I have to say that at first I wasn't into the whole Henry and Lydia storyline, because usually romantic plots make stories more boring, not more interesting. But the conflict it creates between the communities and the Whisperers is pretty interesting, and the tactics they have to use to fight them, since they look like zombies, is a little different also. Daryl thinks he defeats Beta, and all seems quiet for a little bit. They end up having some big fair, and for the first time in a long time it seems like society's coming together. They were even able to resolve their differences diplomatically with a minor hostile group known as the Highwaymen, who actually end up helping them a few times. Things change, however, in the penultimate episode of Season 9, where Alpha infiltrates the fair and ends up killing 10 characters off screen to make a statement that the group should not cross her borders and putting their heads on stakes. A large percentage of the characters that she killed were very minor, some just introduced this season and some who never really got any screen time, but multiple characters were actually pretty major deaths for the show, among the biggest being Tara, Enid, Henry, who was a major character in the second half of this season, and Tammy, one of the elderly women from Hilltop who had a few scenes throughout the seasons. Now, I actually have to say that I liked this decision. It was different and shocking. You expect a couple of major deaths a season, but to have 10 characters all offed at once and not even on screen felt much more chilling and a darker turn for the show, especially with some of them being very major characters, and even more so showing their zombified heads on spikes for the surviving members to see. The final episode of the season jumps to winter. The whole episode shows the group coming together to leave the kingdom and go to Hilltop in the midst of a terrible storm. There's no conflict with the Whisperers here, despite them expressing fear of that happening since they cut through the Whisperers' territory. They make it through, and Negan has a redemptive story arc where he saves Judith and gets his leg injured in the process. He starts to win over the trust of the group slowly. Alpha is shown, and she's preparing for what is coming next by having Beta whip her with a branch. It's unclear what she means by this, though. The episode and season ends with a mysterious voice of a woman on the radio asking if anyone is out there. So overall, the B part of the season was pretty well done and paced, and it showed us a few things that I don't think we've ever seen from this show before. Diplomatic resolutions with hostile groups like with the Highwaymen, antagonists blending in with zombies as the Whisperers, killing off 10 characters at once, even dealing with frost and snow, which was a whole different experience in itself and a brand new setting for the show. But I will say this, the fact that they were able to reel it in for half of Season 9 and give us a good B part of the season doesn't negate any of my criticisms of the show up until this point. The problems that existed to get to this point are still there, and I'm hesitant to believe that some of those problems won't rear their ugly heads again in Season 10 and going forward, but we'll have to wait and see. The last thing I'll talk about in this addendum, I guess, is how Rick's absence affects the show. I actually think that Rick being off the show is a good thing as it stands right now. One of the biggest problems I had with the show is how it spent too much time on storylines and I'm guessing a lot of the audience, didn't really care about. Well, taking an objective look at it, that really means for me personally, was any storyline that didn't include Rick or Daryl. By removing Rick from the show, they allowed other characters to move up in importance and have more interesting storylines naturally, which better balances the characters and stories so it doesn't seem like you're watching so much of one storyline that you aren't interested in, or simply waiting to see what Rick is doing. Now, obviously there are plots that are just sort of duds, for me personally, like the Highwaymen and the Fair, but at least they tried to work them into the main story so it all comes together a little bit quicker. So all in all, maybe The Walking Dead sort of reinventing itself in Season 9 with the removal of Rick will end up being good for the show after all. 20 seasons though? We'll have to wait and see. I know this video was really long, but thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more content. Follow me on Twitter and check out my Patreon if you want to support this channel further. This analysis video took a bit of time to make, and I'm not sure what my next one will be, but when I know for sure, I'll probably announce it on Twitter. So until next time, I'll see you guys in the next video.